This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes. This is my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. We're still in the very early stages of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and so the main topic in this week's video is that I wanted to talk about 10 cards here in the early going of the format that have impressed me, that have performed better than I expected, and I'm going to talk about, each of those cards and why it is they're doing better than I thought. And of course, we'll also do a crack a pack at the end of the video where I talk about what I would take first. So let's get started with our list. There are 10 cards on this list. I'm not going to talk about them in any particular order, though. They're all, overperformers. I'll talk about maybe the degree to which some of them have overperformed and so forth as we get into it. But yeah, there's no set order here. The order doesn't mean anything. We're just going to talk about these 10 overperformers. And first up, there's Michiko's Reign of Truth. This is a card, I thought it would be a powerful build around. That's what I said in my set review. Obviously, coming into play, and the pump effect is very real. I foresaw it being pretty good. But what I didn't foresee is that it would be good in basically every white deck. I haven't had a white deck in this format where Michiko's Reign of Truth wouldn't have given my creatures like a huge stats boost. There's just so many enchantments and artifacts in this set, and those are things that I anticipated, but not to the degree I should have. There's so many of them that her trigger the first 2 times often can win you the game before she even comes into play as a creature, and usually she comes into play quite large. So Michiko's Reign of Truth has been really powerful. One of White's best cards, not even just, when we're talking about commons and uncommons, one of White's best cards. It's a card you should take pretty highly, and it's been really impressive. Another card I want to talk about is Clawing Torment. So this is a card I was a little bit worried about because the effect it has doesn't stop the creature from doing a whole bunch of stuff. And that's normally a problem, but there's a few things going on here that make Clawing Torment a little better than usual. One of them is just that there's a lot of good X1s in this format. There's lots of creatures you can play this on. Your opponent's Simian Sling, using Clawing Torment on that feels pretty great because you get that thing out of the way quickly. Another thing that has been, a boost for Clawing Torment is just the fact that it's an enchantment, and especially in the black-white deck, making sure you have enchantments and artifacts and stuff is pretty good. And even the damage it does has been pretty sweet. It's definitely, still more ideal in an aggro deck, but I thought it was really only going to be a deck you play in a card you play in some decks, but it's been a card I've been happy to have one of in a lot of my black decks. Next up, I want to talk about Go Shintai of Hidden Cruelty. So I thought this would be fine. It can trade with anything, and it'll pick off a creature every now and again is sort of what I was thinking. But it has been even better than I expected, and that is largely for the same reason Clawing Torment has. It just turns out there's an X1 you can kill with Go Shintai of Cruelty, like the turn you play it, a lot of the time. Like most decks in this format are going to have an X1 in play, and by the time you get to Go Shintai of Hidden Cruelty, and it ends up killing it, and as soon as you do that, it feels great. There are 2 cards I want to talk about together now because they're kind of similar. They're both 1-mana sagas. Okiba Reckoner Raid and Kumano faces Kakazan. So I thought both of these would be, really good when you played them on turn 1, and that much has held up. But I was worried about how good they would be later in the game, but overall, like, how good they are in the early game is maybe even better than I anticipated, and they're also more reasonable in the late game than I expected. It just turns out, having to wait a couple turns to get one of these creatures, sure, it's a downside, but you do sort of set things in motion pretty quickly to get that creature, and they both do enough stuff in the meantime to make up for that, and so they've both moved up for me significantly. I think Okiba Reckoner Raid, I talked about it when I talked about best commons and uncommons in last week's Nizzanotes. I said Okiba Reckoner Raid I thought was the 3rd best black common, but, I wasn't so sure it would stay that way, but it has. And I'm even kind of tempted to say it's the 2nd best black common. It's a knee-jerk reaction early from how well this thing has performed. But I think it's, I've felt like it's better than Lethal Exploit in a lot of decks. The menace and giving your vehicles menace, it all matters. And Kumano faces Kakazan, not quite as sweet as Okiba Reckoner Raid, I don't think, but they're both nice. Next, I want to talk about Undercity Scrounger. Now, this one is one that I sort of figured out by the time I got around to my archetype guide, where I was looking at, for black red, what ways do you have to make artifacts and sacrifice them? And in my set review, I really underrated the Undercity Scrounger and didn't take that synergy into account. I thought it would be a fine card, something you play frequently, but nothing special, something you cut a decent chunk of the time too. But it really turns out that, especially in the black red deck, having a way to create these expendable treasure tokens is a big deal for all these sacrifice effects. And, it's also pretty nice in terms of ramp and fixing. Just having access to that is pretty sweet. Next, let's look at Walking Skyscraper. So this is a card I thought would be pretty good. I was in my set review, I basically said, if you can cast this for 6, you're going to feel great. But I wasn't sure how many decks in the format could consistently do it. But kind of like with Michiko's Reign of Truth, it has just turned out that you don't really need to be in a specific deck. Basically, all the decks in the format can cast Walking Skyscraper for like 6. And that has made it a pretty high pick, a card that I feel pretty good about first picking, honestly, in some packs. It's just this huge creature that, is not possible for your opponent to deal with, basically, until you attack with it. And so it's not too bad defensively if that's what you need to do, and it's certainly not bad offensively thanks to that trample. Another one I want to look at is Shrine Steward. Now, this card's not great, even how it's turned out, but it has performed better than I expected. And the main reason for that is mostly the black-white deck, sort of like with Undercity Scrounger. I kind of overlooked the synergy this could have in a particular deck. And especially in black-white, I've been happy with one Shrine Steward pretty often because, first of all, you have access to 2 like premium removal aura spells. You have the arrest effect, and then you have the aura that you stick on your creature, and then it kills a thing. It can search up either of those. So if you just have one copy of each of those, you feel pretty good about the Steward. Obviously, it can search up shrines, but then it also has special synergy just because it's an artifact that gets you an enchantment. And of course, that's sort of the theme for the black-white deck is having at least one artifact and one enchantment in play so that you can get these various bonus effects. And Shrine Steward as a one-of in that very specific deck has been better than I expected it to be. Similarly, Naomi, the black-white signpost uncommon, has been better than I expected. I was kind of down on her, sort of as when I did my set review, I had her basically as the 10th best of the signposts. But it turns out it's pretty doable in the black-white deck to consistently on turn 5 play her and get a 2/2. And if you're doing that in the deck consistently, she's going to perform really well. So overall, been pretty happy with her. Another card I want to look at is Geothermal Kami. Thing has solid stats, and I had a hard time sort of figuring out situations when you'd really want to be returning things to your hand. There aren't that many enchantments with like ETB abilities and stuff, but it turns out there have been more uses than I expected, and it also just turns out that gaining that 3 life has been more relevant than I thought it would. It sort of feels like the creatures you play at like 5 or 6 mana that gain you, some amount of life that we've seen in several formats lately. The Kami kind of fills that slot while also doing some enchantment stuff for you. There's enough flexible things you can do. You can return a creature that's a saga because you want to use the first couple of chapters more, or you want to move your removal aura onto another creature. It's especially gross with the aforementioned 2 generic and 2 black, the aura that you put on your creature for +1/+1 that destroys a creature. It's insane with that one. So there's just a lot you can do with Geothermal Kami, and it has a reasonable floor. So I've been happier with it than I expected it to be. And then the last card I want to look at is Imperial Oath. This is the last of these cards that have overperformed. To me, in the set review, this looked like sort of the random high mana card they sort of shove in the set at common. That's like kind of okay, and you'll play it sometimes. But it turns out that basically you want to be playing one of these in a lot of your white decks. This format has, so far, first of all, it's a very complicated format, especially as far as combat goes. That's one of the overarching things about the format so far for me. But in addition to that, it seems like decks can be pretty fast, but you can also end up in pretty grindy decks too, and they're both viable so far. And Imperial Oath is one of the best ways to stabilize against the more aggressive decks. If you can find a way to sort of stave things off for a while and then cast your Imperial Oath, it's pretty hard for you to lose. I mean, you cast it against them, and you get these three bodies that can usually just trade for everything they've got at worst, and you scry, so you're improving your next few draws. And it's true too, if you're ahead and you cast Imperial Oath, it's pretty hard for you to lose. So it ends up being a common that actually is more powerful than I expected it to be in general, and it's good in a lot of different situations. If you're in the most aggressive white deck ever, some white decks are aggressive enough. Don't play it, but if you're in a lot of these decks, especially the mid-rangier, grindier ones, you pretty much always want one Imperial Oath. Its ability to stabilize or allow you to press your advantage has been impressive to me. All right, let's move now to our Crack-a-Pack. All right, so here is our pack. I'll go through each card, starting with the commons, tell you how I'm feeling about it in the format, and then tell you what I would pick. So, first common is Blossoming Sands. It's a gain land. These are nice in the format. Fixing, fairly abundant in the format, and it's nice to have, but you don't ever really want to be first picking a gain land in this format. Tales of Master Sashiro is next. This has been pretty nice. I like having... I think it's one of Green's better commons. I like having at least one of these in most Green decks. The first two chapters tend to really allow you to do stuff you just couldn't do before. And while initially paying 5 for that effect the first turn doesn't feel great, once you're untapping and doing it again on the second turn, it already feels pretty good. And then you get a very real creature that can really change the game for you in your favor. So Tales of Master Sashiro, pretty good. Definitely what I would be taking at this point in this pack, obviously. Next, we've got Dramatists Puppet. In this day and age, it just seems like the how playable cards are on average has gone up a lot. And this is the kind of card that kind of gets hurt by that because it's like a fine card. It comes down, maybe adds a counter to a thing or takes a counter away. That would have been a fine card for a long time. But, even a format with the counters this format has, the Puppet hasn't really impressed me in any way. I don't really see a reason to play it. Even in a deck with a lot of counters, it just seems like there's way better things you can be doing with 4 mana. Next up, we've got Voltage Surge. This is a nice removal spell. At worst, it does 2 to a creature or planeswalker. And if you have some expendable artifacts to give up, you can do 4. I do think I would take Voltage Surge over Tales of Master Sashiro. I do think they're kind of close in terms of how good they are exactly. But I think Surge is better. I mean, it's premium removal. Crackling Emergence. This maybe has overperformed a tiny bit from what I expected. Hasn't been great, but if you're really in need of, if you're in like a red-green deck that wants to curve out with modified creatures, Crackling Emergence can kind of help you meet that requirement, but it's also really awkward because you're using one of your lands, which if you're actually going to be attacking with the thing will hurt your board development. So it's not a card I like particularly, but I've seen it work a few times. Definitely still Voltage Surge. Brute Suit, decent vehicle, nothing exciting. If you need artifacts or vehicles, it does the job. I don't find myself running it in a lot of decks that aren't really interested in one or both of those things. Reckoner's Bargain is a decent trick. It turns your creature, makes it have 1 more power, gains you some life, and it comes back. It's great when you can trade using it or, blank a removal spell. It's better when you trade because you get to gain the life, like trade with a creature, that is. But it's definitely not something you take early. Tricks basically never are. We're still on Voltage Surge. Now we have Kami's Flair, though, which is another really good red common, probably red's best common. It does 2 mana to do 3 to a creature. That's always a great deal. And if you have a modification somewhere, you also get to shock your opponent. It's a great common. It's definitely what I would take now over Voltage Surge. Next up, it is Golden Tail Disciple. So, not an exciting card, but it does sort of check a lot of boxes in the format between being an enchantment, which a lot of decks, especially green, white, and black, white want. And it has lifelink, which any deck that's like playing counters or enchantment is pretty happy with, but definitely still Kami's Flair. Network Disruptor, this card is one that has really delivered basically exactly like I thought it would in the set review. It is just a really good one drop. You know, we get those all the time now. That really lets you set up ninjutsu. It has artifact synergies. It can just do some silly stuff. That said, I think I would take Kami's Flair and Voltage Surge over it. The Disruptor, by the way, one of these X1s that you're happy to kill with, you know, Go Shintai or, the 1 mana Crawling Torment or whatever, the aura we talked about earlier. It's one of those things that you can just kill with it that feels good. Fang of Shigeki, another good one drop, happens to be an enchantment. It can trade for anything. Still definitely Kami's Flair. I think it would go Kami's Flair, Voltage Surge, Network Disruptor for me in this pack right now. But now we have Gravelighter. This is a card I really like. It's a 3-mana 2/2 flyer at worst. And it has a really neat design where basically if you cast it early, it's probably going to be an Edict effect. And if you cast it late, it probably just draws you a card, which is incredibly strong. And both sides are pretty good. And obviously it doesn't always line up that way, but that's kind of how it ends up working in terms of, creatures tend to die more by the later part of the game. There's more going on. So turning it into a draw a card on top of a Windrake is pretty easy. And it also, in the early game, an Edict effect is better anyway. So I've liked it a lot. I think, I want to say I would take it over Kami's Flair, but it's close. I think I would. I mean, the Gravelighter also has synergy with the Ninja deck. I've liked it a lot. I think I'd take it over Kami's Flair, but it's close. We have the Go Shintai of Hidden Cruelty here. One of the cards I said is an overperformer, and it is, but I would take Gravelighter, Kami's Flair, and Voltage Surge over it, and it and Network Disruptor are pretty close, I think. High Speed Hover Bike. This is another nice card for enabling ninjutsu like the Disruptor. It's a nice little vehicle. It taps a thing just like the Disruptor, and it's easy to crew, can attack in the air, and that's sweet. And then we have Invoke Despair, and these cards are good. I mean, most of them are anyway in this set. If you can cast them, this is the quadruple black one that makes your opponent sacrifice a creature, enchantment, and planeswalker, and if they can't do, for each one of those they can't do, you get to draw a card and they lose 2 life. It's good, but because its mana requirements are so intense, you can't just take it and expect to play it in any deck, and it's not so incredible that I think taking it over a less powerful but much more likely to make your deck card is worth it. And so I think in the end I would take Gravelighter out of this pack rather than Invoke Despair. It is a little awkward that Invoke and Go Shintai are here. So if you take the Gravelighter, this is something to think about sometimes. If you take the Gravelighter, you're passing 2 pretty good black cards, even though one of them is very difficult to cast. I think I would still do it here because it's sort of true too. If you take Kami's Flair, you're passing Voltage Surge. There's not really a good option here where you don't send some signal. I think in the end I'd take Gravelighter here. This is a tough pack though. Like I said, I think it's close between Gravelighter and Kami's Flair. And I would probably take Invoke Despair third just because of the power, even though it may or may not be something you can actually cast. So that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. I'll be back next weekend talking some more about Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Maybe right now I would guess what I'm going to talk about are underperformers, since we're talking about overperformers this week. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, including more Nizzanotes, draft videos, all kinds of limited content, set reviews, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past editions of Nizzanotes, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.